This episode is brought to you by my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. Learn fertility awareness from the comfort of your own home at your own pace for a fraction of the cost. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. The Fifth Vital Sign is available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook formats on Amazon.com. Listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible. Visit fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 269. Welcome to the 269th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm excited to share today's episode with you. In today's episode, I thought I would take some time to dispel a couple of the most common myths about the menstrual cycle and also fertility awareness. If you've been following me on social media over the past couple of months, you have probably noticed that I've been posting a number of myth-busting posts addressing issues such as multiple ovulation during the menstrual cycle, as well as multiple pregnancies. And what I find the most interesting is just as an educator, I've been in this field for over 20 years. I've received my training and certification in this area. And I've also read a ton of research literature on the menstrual cycle and how it works and how ovulation works and how implantation works and all of those types of things. And so it often surprises me, but not necessarily that much. But honestly, it often does surprise me that a lot of these myths continue to remain firmly in place. And the reason that I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and record this episode today is just because, as an educator who teaches women to chart their cycles, what I feel is that these myths around the menstrual cycle and how it works, they leave us in the dark about our cycles and our bodies, because when you adhere to a lot of these myths, it really means that we just haven't been educated about the basic biology behind the menstrual cycle. But it also means that for, those of you who are wanting to use fertility awareness as a birth control method, there's always a lingering, doubt in your mind if it could really work, because essentially, these myths throw all of those biological realities of the menstrual cycle out the window and kind of always leave this possibility of some random event happening. So I hope today's episode will clarify some of these myths. Now, I know that a lot of you who are listening, or at least some of you who are listening, strongly believe the myths. And, my intention is actually not to convince anybody who is adamant that the myths are true. But I feel that this will be an informative episode for those of you who really don't necessarily believe the myths, but don't have a lot of the science or the specific understanding, so that, to just be able to understand it fully yourself or to explain it to others. So I feel like that this episode will be informative. But as I mentioned, my goal is not to try to convince. I know that there are women who will adamantly, argue until the end that I know that ovulation can happen twice in the cycle. And I know that, a woman can be pregnant and become pregnant again. Those are the two myths I'll be addressing today. And so, my goal isn't to convince you. I feel like the benefit of this episode will be for everybody else who isn't necessarily adamant about that myth, but more so just wanting to understand more about how the cycle works. So I think it will be fun. For those of you who are interested in the science behind fertility awareness and really just want to understand more about how it works, for those of you who have used the method yourself, or if you are on your journey starting to use it, starting to chart your cycles, I have cultivated a number of excellent resources for you to support you on your journey. So the first resource is my book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. As you'll hear in today's episode, one of my main goals with the book was to create a resource where it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to take Lisa's word for it. I really wanted to connect you with the science so that if you have further questions or want to do further research, you actually have a place to start. So when I discuss, a variety of different, whether it's specifics around the fertility awareness method or how the menstrual cycle works, or even the normal parameters of the menstrual cycle, what you'll find in the Fifth Vital Sign is, a long list of citations to back up everything I say. So that if you actually do have questions or concerns concerns, or it's often hard when our beliefs are challenged, especially if we have believed these myths for a really long time. We all grew up with a lot of these menstrual cycle myths, and so it's really hard to challenge our own ideas. But if you're looking for the evidence, like where does this information come from, it's all there, to the tune of over 1,000 research citations. And another part of the reason why I feel this is important is because it really reflects a huge disconnect. There's no lack of research verifying the biological function of the menstrual cycle and ovulation and pregnancy. The research is there. So the main question is, how is it that this research doesn't translate? And why is it that the average woman continues to remain in the dark? And so if you haven't grabbed your copy of The Fifth Vital Sign, head over to Amazon. It's available in ebook, paperback, as well as audiobook formats. And if you are an audiobook lover like myself, you can head over to Audible and you can actually listen to the book for free with your trial, your 30-day trial of Audible. So more information there over at fertilityfriday.com/audible. And today's episode is also brought to you by my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. And, I designed this program with you in mind. This program is the most comprehensive fertility awareness self-study program available. And the best part is that you can learn at your own pace, in your own living room, for a fraction of the cost of joining one of my live coaching programs. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details about my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. Now let's jump into today's episode. Okay, so let's jump right into today's episode. And so basically what we'll be talking about today are two of the biggest myths about how the menstrual cycle works. And we've talked about a lot of the myths on the show, and I've done a few episodes recently where I've tackled some of the most common myths. And so some of the most common myths include, the menstrual cycle is always 28 days, ovulation always happens on day 14, women are fertile every single day. And so those and other myths, what I'll do is I'll link some related episodes in the show notes page. So if this is an interesting topic to you and you really want to spend some time just debunking a lot of the common myths about the menstrual cycle and increasing your own awareness of how the menstrual cycle works, make sure to head over to the show notes page, which you'll find over at fertilityfriday.com/269. And I will link all of the, related myth busting episodes. And, if you're listening in your favorite podcast app, you can just kind of tap on the screen or, push it to the side or whatever you need to do in order to see the show notes page. But you'll see the related episodes listed there. In today's episode, though, we're going to be talking about the two big ones that have been I suppose they've been on my radar over the past couple of months. As I mentioned, I've been posting a lot, doing a lot of myth busting, as I often do. And these seem to be the two that stick. I always get, people basically saying, no, you're wrong. This can happen. So the two main myths that I will be talking about in today's episode are the myth of double ovulation. So the myth that you can ovulate once in the cycle and go on to ovulate again. So that is actually a myth. It is not true. It's not possible. And we'll talk about why. And then the second myth is that a woman can become pregnant. So she can ovulate once in her cycle and become pregnant. And then while she's pregnant, she can actually ovulate again and become pregnant like twice. So though that is also a myth, so that is not true. That's a myth. And we'll talk about why neither of those two situations are possible. We'll talk about what some of the situations are that can occur that can be misinterpreted for those two events. And of course, I'm drawing directly from the scientific literature. So I'll be linking the studies to this episode for those of you who are very skeptical and want to see where this information is coming from. So let's start with the myth of multiple ovulations. I think the most important and potentially helpful aspect of this conversation is to start with just a basic foundation of how the menstrual cycle works so that you can start appreciating why multiple ovulations don't happen in the cycle. And one of the things that I'll say is for any of you who have charted your own cycles, it's one thing to listen to someone like me talk about these events, but it's another thing to actually chart your cycles. So if you're listening to this episode and you find yourself thinking, absolutely not, this girl doesn't know what she's talking about, I totally disagree, then, I would say the first step is to actually start charting your cycles for yourself. Because as soon as you chart your cycles, and let's say you've charted your cycles for 6 months or 12 months or 2 years or 5 years, or like in my case, almost 20 years, then you really start to see and understand the biology of what happens in the menstrual cycle for yourself. Because it's no longer in a textbook and it's no longer a concept or an idea, but it's actually your physical body. And you start to understand what changes happen throughout the cycle. So let's first start by taking you through the menstrual cycle. So at the very beginning of the menstrual cycle, day 1 of your cycle is day 1 of your period, and it's day 1 of your true characteristic flow. And in order to have a true menstrual period, ovulation had to happen about 12 to 14 days prior. So it is possible to have bleeding if you didn't ovulate. For example, if you're, taking the birth control pills, you can have bleeding whenever you stop, have a couple of days off of the hormones, or you take your sugar pills, or if you're using the patch or the ring and you pull it out for a couple of days. But that didn't, there was no ovulation prior to that bleeding. And so that in that case of the birth control pills, that would be withdrawal bleeding. And if you are charting your cycles and you notice that you didn't ovulate, you didn't have a temperature shift, there was no ovulation, but you had a couple of days of bleeding, we can refer to that as anovulatory bleeding. So I think the first thing to know about the menstrual cycle is that your true menstrual period happens about 12 to 14 days after ovulation in a healthy cycle. And so when we're talking about like the menstrual cycle, I'm talking about starting with a true menstrual period here. Okay, so you have your period, and then what happens is we get into the first half of the cycle. So as you approach ovulation, what happens is your follicles start to develop in your ovaries. And as those follicles develop, they produce estrogen. So as you approach ovulation, your follicles are developing, they're producing increasing amounts of estrogen, and that estrogen has a number of different effects on the menstrual cycle, and effects that you can actually observe. So, one of the effects that you don't necessarily observe until you get your period later on is that estrogen stimulates the endometrial lining to grow. One of the effects that you can observe is that estrogen stimulates cervical mucus production. So for any of you who are charting, you'll know that as you approach ovulation, you typically see a change in your cervical fluid. So you might go from not seeing any to starting to see some lotiony type or clear, stretchy, kind of like raw egg white type mucus. Or you may just notice that when you're going to the bathroom, it feels really slippery when you're wiping yourself. But either way, these are the effects of estrogen. Now, for those of you who are checking your cervical position, you'll find that if you consistently check, so you have to have a little bit of patience when it comes to the cervix, but if you're consistently checking your cervical position every day, so essentially inserting your finger into your vagina and feeling around, palpating your cervix, you'll notice that as you approach ovulation, as those estrogen levels rise, your cervix becomes softer, and you may feel that it's a little bit open, you may feel a bit of a dimple, and you may feel that it's at a higher position in your vagina. But either way, there is a change from, what happens outside of your fertile window to when you're in your fertile window. And so what is important to know about ovulation is that ovulation doesn't happen at random. So there are some animal species where ovulation may be triggered from sexual arousal. So, if you're horny or something, boom, ovulation. But with human beings, it doesn't work like that. We do not ovulate in response to sexual arousal, and it does not happen at random. Ovulation happens because of a series of hormonal events. So estrogen rises to a certain point, and once it rises high enough, it actually triggers our pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. So there's a feedback loop happening. And then the luteinizing hormone, that's what the ovulation predictor kits test for. That is what triggers ovulation. And, in a normal typical cycle, ovulation would happen anywhere from about 24 to 36 hours after that luteinizing hormone surge. Okay. So first, I suppose it'll be helpful to take you through like a normal typical cycle, and then we will talk about some of the reasons why a person may think that they ovulated more than once. However, in those cases, they may be misinterpreting the events. Okay, so you had the first half of your cycle, your ovaries were producing estrogen, it reached to a certain point, threshold, and then that triggered your luteinizing hormone, which then triggered ovulation about 24 to 36 hours later. So when you ovulate, I just want you to picture what's happening in your abdomen. Your ovaries during ovulation actually burst open. So the ovary itself actually ruptures and the egg comes out. So the ovary physically changes during ovulation in order for the egg to come out. And once that happens, after the ovary ruptures, and there's quite literally then a scar on your ovary because it just ruptured, what then the same follicle then that was producing all the estrogen that burst during ovulation, it turns into the corpus luteum. So if you were to look inside of the abdominal cavity, you would actually see what looks like a scar on the ovary, the corpus luteum, and then that physical structure, because of that change, then what happens is your corpus luteum starts producing progesterone. And so you produce significant amounts of progesterone after ovulation, and you only produce significant amounts of progesterone after ovulation. There's no significant progesterone production in the menstrual cycle unless you do ovulate. And so then progesterone has a number of effects on the body that counteract the effects that estrogen was having before. So progesterone shuts down further ovulation. It actually closes the cervix and it stops the production of that cervical mucus that you were observing before. So progesterone stimulates the cervix to fill with a thick gelatinous mucus plug that is a physical barrier that prevents sperm from being able to swim through and access your cervix, your uterine cavity, and your fallopian tubes. And also, progesterone stimulates your cervix itself. And for those of you who are checking your cervical position every day, after ovulation, you'll notice that the cervix does close, it feels more firm, and it goes into a different position in the uterus, or in your vagina, I should say. And so what that means is that when you're charting your cycles, you can feel the physical shift that happens in your body, the physical change in your cervix, and the positioning and the feeling. You can feel it go from open to close. So this is a physical change that happens in your body, and it's biology. And there's quite a bit of research on the different types of cervical mucus that you produce during your cycle. And so, you can confirm it with research, but you can also confirm it by actually just charting your cycles, the difference in cervical mucus production throughout your menstrual cycle. And so then the mucus, if you're checking for mucus, what happens after ovulation in a typical cycle is that your mucus dries up either completely, or you'll see a definite shift from what it looked like during your fertile window. And so these changes are all happening as a result of progesterone. And then what would happen in a typical cycle is that, if there was no exposure to sperm, if you didn't have unprotected sex, then, you'd get your period about 12 to 14 days later. Or if you were trying to get pregnant, or, you had unprotected sex in the fertile window and there was sperm in your reproductive tract that fertilized an egg, then you would go on to become pregnant. Now, of course, we know that, a woman can release more than one egg at ovulation because we all know that fraternal twins happen. And so, again, ovulation doesn't just happen at random, and it can't just happen at any point during the cycle. So what happens in a case where a woman releases more than one egg, it is possible, since, the majority of us have two ovaries, two ovaries there. So if you are approaching ovulation, it is possible for both ovaries to develop and the follicles on both ovaries to develop an egg. And as our estrogen levels rise, it's the same hormone cycle that happens, except you just picture both of the ovaries doing it at the same time. So, follicles are developing, estrogen levels are rising, and once those estrogen levels reach the peak, again, our pituitary secretes luteinizing hormone, and that triggers ovulation. So if there's more than one follicle that is mature at the time of, ovulation, then it'll respond to that luteinizing hormone surge. And, eggs can be released from both ovaries, but it would happen on that one day, that 12 to 24 hour period. So ovulation can only happen on that one day. And then once you ovulate, we have a series of hormonal shifts and changes that actually prevent it from happening again. And so I think this concept is much more tangible and much easier to understand for women who are charting their cycles actively. Because once you start charting, every cycle that you chart is additional information that basically deepens your understanding of this for yourself, because it helps you to understand it in your bones, because you can see it for yourself, and you can see that there are specific physiological changes that you can monitor and measure that occur only after ovulation. And so, I think that's one of the challenges for women who have never had the opportunity to chart their cycles or who haven't had the opportunity to learn this information. It can be difficult to challenge some of these ideas because really, if we're not taught about how our body works, then how can we even know the difference between fact and fiction? Okay, so now that we've gone through the basics and the anatomy, what we're going to talk about are some of the events that are commonly misinterpreted as multiple ovulations. One of the great things about the internet and Dr. Google is that you can literally Google anything you want and you'll find evidence for and evidence to the contrary. And so even if you were to do a search for like double ovulations, you'll see all these articles that say women can ovulate twice, they can ovulate more than once. And there are some of these articles that actually cite scientific references. And there's one study that I'll link in the show notes called A New Model for Ovarian Follicular Development During the Human Menstrual Cycle. And this study is cited in, several different articles basically saying this is proof that ovulation can happen twice. Now, what's interesting about this study is that they're looking specifically at follicular development. So in the study, they show that it's possible for a woman's follicles to develop and let's say, for example, the follicles develop and they start to grow and then they kind of back off or stop and then they kind of go on to develop again. And I'll note that the study doesn't actually confirm ovulation with some of the accepted ways that you can actually confirm ovulation. So let's talk, first of all, before I get into some of those events that are commonly misinterpreted as multiple ovulation, as how you would actually go about confirming ovulation in the menstrual cycle. So in order to confirm that ovulation has actually occurred, there are a few different ways that you can go about it. One, if you're charting your cycles, so a lot of you who are listening to the show are already in the midst of your charting journey. So you'll already know we confirm ovulation at home when we're charting by monitoring our basal body temperature. And so essentially, basal body temperature is a measure of your body's resting metabolism. And so, when we get up first thing in the morning, before we've gotten out of bed, after we've had, ideally at least 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep, we would take our resting body temperature. So having the minimum of 5 hours uninterrupted sleep allows our body to go back into that state of rest. And so that would allow essentially our bodies to get back to that resting metabolism level. And so if you are charting your cycles and you're taking your temperature every morning, then what you'll find consistently is that after you ovulate, and I mean really ovulate, after your ovary has released an egg, and we talked about how the ovary bursts and you start to produce significant amounts of progesterone. So that progesterone that you produce causes a change in your metabolism. And it causes a change that you can actually measure on a chart on a graph. And it's fascinating for any of you who are kind of in that science nerdy place. It's really cool to see these changes in your body. And as you continue to chart, so again, this is why it's easier to understand when you chart your cycles. So as you continue to chart your cycles for several months and years, any woman who's been charting her cycle for a couple of years or more and who has been monitoring her temperatures in alignment with her mucus and her cervical position changes will attest that you can tell when you ovulate based on the temperatures. Of course, there are times when the temperatures might be hard to read if you're sick, but all of those types of interferences notwithstanding, it's pretty clear. And so in order to confirm your ovulation with your temperature, you're looking for a sustained shift in temperature. And so once you've ovulated, you're producing significant amounts of progesterone. And when you're measuring that, temperature every day when you get out of, before you get out of bed, you'll notice that there is a shift in your temperature, rises, and then it stays high for the remainder of your cycle. So on your chart, you'll see a group of temperatures pre-ovulatory that are just within a certain range and a separate group of temperatures after ovulation that are within a certain range, but it's always higher. And so you typically can draw a line between your pre and post ovulatory temperatures. I'm from the old school, I still chart on paper, but you can draw a line between the pre and post ovulatory temperatures. And once you've actually ovulated, those temperatures don't drop back down. They just stay up because the progesterone actually increases your metabolism. So if you're also monitoring your other two phases, I've already alluded to, how your cervical mucus will either completely dry up or there'll be a shift. So it'll be different than what you saw in your fertile window. Most often it'll, dry up, but for some women, they may still continue to see some like lotiony or something like that for, a couple of days. Or some women may even have a random day of clear, stretchy, or like an observation or something like that. But when you look at the cycles and the charts, cycle after cycle, chart after chart, you'll see that there is a very specific shift that happens. The cervical mucus does dry up and or significantly change post-ovulation. And then thirdly, the cervical position, as we talked about, changes as well. So there's these physical changes that happen that you can actually measure and write down. So that's how you could do it at home. Now, with charting and gauging your basal body temperature, honestly, it is second to getting a daily ultrasound, the best way to really confirm these things without any heavy technology. But, to fully confirm it in the most kind of scientific manner, you would either have to undergo daily ultrasounds. And I mean, I don't know anyone that has an ultrasound machine in their house, but daily ultrasounds. So if you were to have an ultrasound every single day and they were monitoring ovarian follicular development, then you would be able to pinpoint the date of ovulation. You'd actually be able to do that. But in order to confirm ovulation via ultrasound in that way, you'd have to actually get that ultrasound daily to verify exactly when it occurred in the cycle. And there's a difference between follicular development and ovulation. So if you were monitoring ovarian function and follicular development throughout the cycle, it would be possible to see follicles developing. The first half of the cycle is most variable. So it is possible to your body to be gearing up to ovulation and for you to approach ovulation, but for ovulation to be delayed and not actually occur. So it is possible to have more than one wave of follicular development in the menstrual cycle, and that does not confirm that ovulation has occurred on two separate occasions. So in addition to then ultrasound, like daily ultrasounds, again, I suppose you could say the most scientific way to measure ovulation would be a blood test to verify your progesterone levels. So because you're only producing significant amounts of progesterone post-ovulation, one of the ways that doctors will confirm if ovulation occurred in the cycle is to actually test your blood to find out where your progesterone levels are. And because if your progesterone levels are a certain level, they're not, the only explanation is that you ovulated unless you're actually actively taking progesterone supplements. And that would be a different conversation. Okay, so I wanted to preface it by that because I want to be clear that there's specific ways to confirm ovulation. And unless a person is actually confirming ovulation in a scientific manner, then we can't make the assumption that more than one ovulation occurred. So let's go back now to some of the events that are often commonly misinterpreted as multiple ovulations. The first is multiple waves of follicular development. So this is something that I've already alluded to, but as I mentioned, there is an article that is commonly referred to as evidence that women can ovulate more than once in the menstrual cycle. And this article is called A New Model for Ovarian Follicular Development During the Human Menstrual Cycle. In this article, they are measuring, so they're doing ultrasounds, not daily, but they are doing ultrasounds throughout the cycle, and they're basically measuring follicles and then drawing conclusions for that. And so and they're not actually confirming ovulation in the accepted ways that you would confirm ovulation. So they're not testing for progesterone levels to verify that ovulation in fact occurred. They're not doing daily ultrasounds to confirm the specific date of ovulation, and they're not looking at basal body temperature or cervical mucus or any of the fertility awareness signs. So what they're doing in that particular study is they're actually measuring they're measuring the size of the follicles, and then based on the changes in the size of the follicles, they're drawing the conclusion that, and they're not, in the conclusion itself of the study, they're looking at, the conclusion they come to, it says the follicular wave phenomenon in women provides a new model for ovarian function during the menstrual cycle and will improve our understanding of the ovarian response to fertility and hormonal contraceptive regimens. So, this study, they're trying to increase their understanding of the ovarian cycle and the ovarian follicular development as it pertains to the possibilities related to artificial reproductive technology. And, so they're not verifying that ovulation happens more than once. They're really verifying that you can actually track multiple waves of follicular development within the menstrual cycle. And that is very different than confirming that ovulation happens more than once in the menstrual cycle. So I spoke about this in one of the episodes that I recorded shortly after I released my book, The Fifth Vital Sign. And one of my main points was that you have to actually read the research yourself. You have to read through the whole study, the full text, and interpret it logically, because you can take a lot of things and twist them into whatever you want them to be without recognizing, okay, why did they do the study? What were they looking for? What were the results? Did they confirm that ovulation was occurring, and was that their intention? And so again, I would encourage you to take a critical eye, especially if you're looking at articles and things like that, because anyone can write an article about anything. And, you can write an article about a research study that you didn't even read, if you just looked at the summary part of it or something like that, and you may not even fully understand what the intentions of the researchers were or what the information that they're sharing even means in the context of, say, the menstrual cycle in this case. So multiple waves of follicular development can be misinterpreted as multiple ovulations. So if you have an ultrasound and there looks like there's a follicle that's a certain size, and then you have another one and there's a follicle of a certain size, it is possible throughout the ovarian cycle for follicles to develop and mature, and for that not to result in ovulation. And so again, for any woman who has tracked her menstrual cycle for a period of time, just depending on how long you've tracked it and what types of cycles you've observed within yourself, this is something that, many women who chart their cycles already know. So it's possible to move towards ovulation. As your follicles develop and grow, they produce estrogen. You start to produce cervical mucus, and perhaps something happens. Either there's something happening within your body if you are somewhere on the PCOS spectrum and your body is sensitive to sugars, glucose, resistant to insulin. These are factors that can actually delay ovulation. Similar to if you are stressed or you experience something, ovulation can be delayed. And in fact, the first half of the menstrual cycle, so the pre-ovulatory phase, is the most susceptible to disruption. When there are, dramatic changes in the length of the menstrual cycle, so if one cycle, your cycle is, 29 days, and the following cycle it's like 45 days, that means that ovulation was delayed in that cycle. And so multiple waves of follicular development can be misinterpreted as multiple ovulations, as well as multiple patches of cervical mucus, delayed ovulations, and double peaks. So basically, let me paint you a picture. So if your cycle happens to be really long, or you kind of looking back on a cycle, ovulation doesn't occur until, say, day 30 or something like that, and you're tracking your cycles, you may notice that you are, having cervical mucus for several days, and, you think, okay, I'm going to ovulate now, but then your temperatures don't rise, and, nothing really lines up. And then you might start to see cervical mucus again, for a couple of days. So that scenario is called a double peak. It's very well known, common, and documented within the fertility awareness world. And really and truly, that is not a sign that ovulation occurred twice. It's a sign that your body was gearing up to ovulation, your hormone levels started to rise, and something basically suppressed ovulation and or delayed it until a later time. If you were to have, ultrasounds kind of randomly scattered throughout that period of time, you would likely hear from the person who's interpreting your ultrasound that follicles are developing, and they may even say something that would make you think that ovulation is happening more than once. But again, in those situations, we have no confirmed ovulation. There's no sustained basal body temperature shift. There's no progesterone testing to verify that you are in that post-ovulatory range. And so it's really important that we recognize that those are situations that can be misinterpreted as double ovulation, even though ovulation was never confirmed in those. And then, one of the last events that can be commonly misinterpreted as multiple ovulation would be positive ovulation predictor kits. So for example, it is possible to have a positive ovulation predictor kit result and not ovulate. For some women, I'll give the example of polycystic ovary syndrome again. So one of the signs of PCOS is an elevated LH levels. Women with PCOS are known to have rapid LH pulse secretions, meaning that, some women with PCOS will secrete a lot of luteinizing hormone throughout their cycle. And so some of these women will have positive ovulation predictor kits all the time, and it has nothing to do with whether or not they ovulated. And furthermore, ovulation predictor kits do not confirm that ovulation has occurred. They're detecting for that luteinizing hormone surge, which in a typical cycle will occur about 24 to 36 days 24 to 36 hours prior to ovulation. So a positive ovulation predictor kit multiple times in the menstrual cycle does not mean that you ovulated multiple times. It means that your LH levels were elevated multiple times. And those are two different things. So I'll just kind of repeat that short list. So events that are commonly misinterpreted as multiple ovulations include multiple waves of follicular development as detected on ultrasounds, multiple patches of cervical mucus, delayed ovulation, double peaks, and positive ovulation predictor kits. And I'll link, I've done an entire episode on ovulation predictor kits that I reference often. And so I'll link that in the show notes page. So it's episode 149 if you want to hear more about the OPKs. Okay, so we spoke about the reasons that ovulation can't happen again in the menstrual cycle. So once you ovulate, you produce progesterone. It stimulates your cervix to fill with a thick mucus plug. It changes the cervix. It changes the position of the cervix. It dries up your mucus, and it suppresses further ovulation. And so as I mentioned, that's just to kind of summarize the first part of it. So I'm sure that there will be interesting discussions that will come out of this episode. So I'll open up a chat in the Facebook group, fertilityfriday.com/community, and we could talk about it there. And I'm sure I'll have a post on Instagram when this comes out, so we can talk about it there as well. I'm at Fertility Friday. So let's then talk about the second big myth I wanted to cover in this episode, which is the myth of multiple pregnancies. So the myth that it is possible to ovulate and become pregnant in a menstrual cycle and then ovulate, whether it's several weeks later or months later, and then become pregnant again. So again, this is a myth, and it stays strong and alive because, again, we are not taught about the menstrual cycle. We're not taught about the basic biology of female reproductive anatomy. And that miss or that lack of information is what allows these myths to continue and to stay strong. So the concept of getting pregnant while you're already pregnant, there's a word for it, and it's called superfetation. And so you can look it up. You can Google that. And so I think, again, we have to take it back to how the menstrual cycle works. And so I'm going to actually reference an article that talks about this in really great detail, which is pretty awesome. The article is called "The Concept of Superfetation, a Critical Review on a Myth in Mammalian Reproduction." And what's interesting and helpful about this article is that it's not just talking about human beings, it's talking about mammals. And so you can see and understand how and where some of these ideas come from, because there are certain species of animal where these types of things can occur. And as you learn more about it, then you can appreciate that human beings, if you understand how the human reproductive cycle operates, why this is something that just can't happen. So let's talk about what would need to happen in order for a woman to get pregnant while she was already pregnant. And what I typically say is that you don't know anybody out there who has become pregnant and then become pregnant again and then had two different due dates. Like she was carrying two babies, and one was due in September and one was due in January or something like that. But as I've shared this information, there are women who will say, no, I did know somebody who was pregnant with two different babies that were due on two different days. So let's talk about it. Okay, so in order for a woman to become pregnant while she was already pregnant, 3 main things would have to happen. So the first thing that would have to happen is she would have to actually ovulate while she was pregnant. So that's the first thing that would have to happen. So she would actually have to ovulate while pregnant. The second thing that would have to happen is that there would have to be semen, so sperm, in her reproductive tract. There would have to be sperm in her fallopian tubes, her cervix, her uterus. Sperm would have to actually be in there and alive in order to fertilize this egg that was ovulated while she was already pregnant. And then the third thing that would have to happen in order for a woman to become pregnant while she was already pregnant is that the endometrium would have to be receptive to implantation. Okay, so those 3 things would have to happen. So let's talk about the first point, ovulation. So after ovulation occurs in the menstrual cycle, you produce a significant amount of progesterone. We talked a little bit about what causes ovulation to happen and how the follicles are developing and they're producing significant amounts of estrogen. So in the pre-ovulatory phase, before a woman has ovulated, the hormonal situation in her body is completely different than the hormonal situation post-ovulation. So once she is ovulated, and as I mentioned, it's a physical change to the ovaries that results in a scar on the ovaries, so the corpus luteum, and that causes a shift in our hormone production. We're producing significant amounts of progesterone. During pregnancy, by the time a woman is 40 weeks pregnant, she is producing more than 11 times the progesterone that she was producing during the normal menstrual cycle. So pregnancy is a completely different hormonal time. It's almost like a second puberty. You're producing such high levels of estrogen and progesterone that it actually changes your body. It changes your breasts, prepares your breasts for breastfeeding. It changes your brain. I mean, it really completely changes your body so that you're able to grow a human life. So first things first, ovulation is not possible in that stage, in that hormonal state, because the progesterone actually suppresses further ovulation. And so this is biology. That is the first part. So in terms of the semen, so in order for pregnancy to occur while pregnant, ovulation would have to happen, which is suppressed. Semen would actually have to be there to fertilize an egg. That would have to happen. Now, it's well documented that when a woman ovulates, her cervix fills with a thick mucus plug. And that's something that if you wanted to, buy a speculum on Amazon and take a look at your own cervix, post ovulation, or if you're charting your cycles and you feel the change in your cervix and you actually monitor the change in your cervical mucus, you can see that for yourself. But what happens is, when you have that thick mucus plug in place, sperm are not able to penetrate. So this is biology. There are a number of research papers where they test to see if the sperm is able to penetrate, and the sperm are not able to penetrate. They can't get in. Your cervix is closed. So once you've ovulated, the cervix actually closes and sperm can no longer gain access to your uterus. And that makes sense that our bodies would have this natural protection because, if our uterus was just open all the time to potential viruses and bacteria, that would really leave us more susceptible to infection. So this is quite an important biological function of our bodies to prevent any unnecessary exposure to any type of foreign pathogens. And then what happens during pregnancy, so if you've, again, with the scientific aspect of it, if you study Eric Odblad's work, he categorized different types of the G-type mucus, which is the mucus plug. And so when you become pregnant, as I mentioned, your progesterone levels increase significantly, and that actually causes the mucus plug to thicken in some ways. So Eric Odblad actually categorized the mucus plug that you have during pregnancy as a separate type of G mucus due to the increased level of progesterone. So let me just put that in another way. After you ovulate, your cervix is closed and it fills with a plug that prevents sperm from penetrating. Once you get pregnant, that plug becomes even stronger. And again, sperm cannot penetrate. So there's no access. If you were to have unprotected sex while you were in your post-ovulatory phase and or during pregnancy, you can have all the sex all the time and there will never be any sperm in your cervix or your uterus or your fallopian tubes because it is actually physically blocked by a mucus plug. So that's the second part. So in order to get pregnant post-pregnancy, you would have to ovulate, which is suppressed, and then sperm would have to actually make it into your cervix and uterus and fallopian tubes, which it can't happen because it's actually physically blocked. And again, this is biology. This is something that is easily verifiable just by looking at the biology. Okay, and the third thing that would have to happen is the endometrium would have to be able to accept a blastocyst. So, in order for pregnancy to happen, not only do you have to ovulate, there has to be sperm present, fertilization has to occur. But I think one of the aspects of pregnancy and how it works and conception that many people may not realize is that there's only a short window of time when your endometrium is actually receptive to a fertilized egg. And so again, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, I will link the research studies that I'm referring to, but implantation, so the process of actually having the egg implant into your uterine lining, there's only about a 4-day period, a 4-day window when implantation can actually happen. And so, if you were to look at a typical cycle, you ovulate. If, let's say, this is a pregnancy cycle, so she had sex during her fertile window when her cervix was open and when she was producing cervical mucus, and, the sperm were able to enter into her cervix and her fallopian tubes. So when she ovulated, the sperm were already there in the fallopian tubes and the egg was fertilized. So from that point, it takes about, 5 or 6 days or so. So just shy of a week for that fertilized egg to make its way into the uterus. And then there's a short, about 4-day window of time when the uterus is receptive to a fertilized egg. And so part of this incredible cycle of how our bodies work is that after we ovulate, we produce a significant amount of progesterone, and progesterone is crucial for priming the endometrium for implantation and for making the endometrial lining receptive to implantation. And so there's this tiny little window of time where the endometrial lining is actually saying, okay, this is great, and where implantation can actually occur. And then it takes several days for implantation to finalize, which is why the post-ovulatory phase in a healthy cycle is between 12 and 14 days to allow enough time for implantation to happen. And in order for that to occur, we need to be producing sufficient progesterone. And so just to put that out there, so it's not that implantation could just happen anytime. Implantation has to happen at a very specific time in the cycle. So when a woman is already pregnant, her endometrial lining is not receptive to implantation. That window is done and closed because now her endometrial lining is in a completely different stage. And again, she has a significant amount of her natural hormones, estrogen and progesterone, flowing through her body that are, causing the endometrial lining to develop in different ways to support the life of her growing baby. So that's the first thing I want to mention. So in order for just to try to shatter this myth that a woman can become pregnant while she's already pregnant, because this is a biological function of the human body. It's not something that just happens at random. And pregnancy, in many ways, the more you learn about the concept of, conception and fertilization and how everything has to work together just magically in order for conception to occur, it really is a wonder, just how it works and what all of the things that have to happen in order for pregnancy to occur. So I think the main message is that pregnancy doesn't occur at random and it can't just happen whenever. There is a specific period of time in the cycle when ovulation occurs, when a woman is fertile. There's a specific fertile window. Ovulation only happens on the one day. It doesn't happen multiple times. And implantation can't just happen whenever either. So there's only a small window of receptivity when the endometrium is actually receptive to a fertilized egg. So similar to what we did with the multiple ovulations, I wanted to go through a few situations that are often mistaken for superfetation. So the concept of a woman being pregnant and then being pregnant again. So and again, I'm taking this from the article that I mentioned that I'll have listed with this episode. But one of the scenarios that is often misinterpreted for basically getting pregnant and then getting pregnant again is having multiple eggs fertilized from that one ovulation. So if a woman, develops more than one egg during that one day of ovulation, which is entirely possible, as we know, and potentially if she had sex with more than one person within her fertile window, for example. So the fertile window, again, the research shows that the fertile window is 5 days plus the day of ovulation. So there have been a number of studies that are done where they actually look at where pregnancy happens in the cycle. So they'll have couples that are having sex at different times of their cycle and note when pregnancy occurred based on when they were having sex. And so it's well established that the fertile window is 5 days plus the day of ovulation. And the reason for that is because sperm can survive in a woman's cervical mucus for up to 5 days. So, there's no information to suggest that sperm can survive longer than 5 days in a woman's reproductive tract in her cervical mucus. And so essentially, a woman could have sex with one partner on Monday and another partner on, Thursday. And if it just so happened to be in her fertile window, and it just so happened that this would be a really chance event, but it just so happened that she ovulated, 2 eggs during that one ovulation day. And it just so happened that, one of the sperm from either individual fertilized the egg, then she could actually be pregnant with twins by 2 different fathers. And that, again, that doesn't mean that she ovulated more than once, but that could be misinterpreted as just this concept of getting pregnant when she's already pregnant. And I've even heard of a situation where a woman she ended up being pregnant with twins, but she had been undergoing, IVF procedures. And again, if she's having sex on a fertile day prior to ovulation, and then she has a procedure done several days later and then ends up pregnant with twins for 2 different, fathers, that is entirely possible. And again, that can be misinterpreted as meaning that she ovulated again later on in the cycle. Because keep in mind that in situations like this where the conclusion is drawn that ovulation happened twice, they're not confirming ovulation in the ways that we spoke about. So they're not actually confirming that ovulation happened twice. They're looking at what's happening afterwards and saying, okay, this must mean that she ovulated twice. And then the overarching message that I mentioned a number of times is that because we don't know how the body works and we're not really educated about the female reproductive system, then it makes us more likely to believe these myths as opposed to understanding the true biology of what's happening. Okay, so this article was talking about how this could happen in mammals. And so these are things that wouldn't happen in human beings. So one of the scenarios that they mentioned was delayed implantation, where there's sperm that fertilize an egg or something like that. And certain mammals actually can store fertilized eggs in their bodies, and then they can develop later on. And they mention here, let me see what they mention. So it says oocytes, usually from one ovulation, are fertilized but implanted at different dates. Dormant blastocysts can be present in the uterus for varying periods of time depending on the species, days to weeks in some mice or many years in kangaroos. So they're basically saying in mice and kangaroos, it's possible for eggs to be fertilized and then hang out and then be implanted at a different time. But this is not true for humans. One of the examples that I've seen that would more so be commonly mistaken as a potential double, ovulation, double pregnancy at different times is developmental retardation, embryonic death, and reabsorption. So basically, many of the situations that I've come across where individuals are adamant that, okay, pregnancy happened more than once in the cycle, and I know because it was confirmed. Often it's a situation where a woman is pregnant with twins, and maybe she didn't know that she was pregnant with twins from the beginning. But she's pregnant with twins, and when they measure the babies via ultrasound, so they actually measure the babies, you'll have 2 babies that have different measurements. And so one baby will be a lot smaller than the other. And so when you have an ultrasound and they measure, the baby to see how old the baby is, they're quite literally measuring that baby. They're not confirming when ovulation occurred. And so it is possible to be pregnant with 2 babies and to have one baby not develop normally. And so there are documented situations of this when there may be exposure to infection or there's some sort of morphological issue. So here it says, in human babies, differences in the development of multiple pregnancies can occur, with most cases caused by pathological circumstances. So in situations like that, there are specific reasons why maybe one baby isn't developing at the same rate as another baby. And there are situations where a woman may be pregnant with twins and one of the twins doesn't survive. And so then you end up having one twin that, survives and another that is not. I think it's important to be really critical. When we hear situations like that, it's really easy to draw conclusions based on a preliminary analysis. And to be clear, if a person is pregnant with twins and the twins measure differently, that is not confirmation that the woman ovulated while she was pregnant and conceived while she was pregnant. Because as we talked about, previously, that is not possible. Those three main things have to happen. A woman would have to ovulate, sperm would have to be in the reproductive tract, and the uterine line, the endometrium, would have to be receptive to implantation. And based on the biology of the human body and how the reproductive cycle works, neither of those things are possible. And so again, in those situations, was ovulation confirmed? Was that woman having a daily ultrasound every day that she was pregnant to verify this ovulation happened twice? If she did a progesterone test while she was pregnant, her progesterone would be quite high, indicating that ovulation already occurred because she is already pregnant. And again, the endometrial receptivity, it can't just be receptive at any given time. There's a specific window of time when the endometrium is receptive. And then another example that was given in this article was conception during a pregnancy in retrogression. So another possibility would be, and a sad possibility, if a woman became pregnant and perhaps she wasn't aware, but she miscarried. So she miscarried, but potentially the fetus didn't actually expel. And then she did have another cycle and then, conceived. And so they give this example. It says here, this phenomenon was described by a researcher named Sparrow for the rat and for breeding pigs. So they're saying that certain mammals may have a situation where they get pregnant and then they basically suffer fetal loss, and then another cycle happens and they get pregnant again. So again, those are not situations where a woman is ovulating twice while pregnant. And again, it's really important. The reason that I feel that it's important to just address and dispel these myths is I just can't imagine the stress that it would cause to think that you could be pregnant and still have to be vigilant and worry about not getting pregnant a subsequent time. My hope and aim is to educate and to share the information and to connect you with the science as much as I can so that we can just get on with it. I mean, it's 2019. How is it possible that we can be in, it feels like ancient times where we can still believe that we have the same reproductive anatomy as kangaroos and mice and pigs? It's about time that we start to recognize and understand the normal biological functions of the female body and put some of these myths to rest. Now, with that said, I just wanted to conclude with two examples of how this could possibly happen and to illustrate what would have to occur in order for something like this to happen. So basically, in a human woman's body, if there was some sort of developmental issue with the uterus, so for example, women who have a bicornuate uterus, this is a type of anomaly where there's a deep indentation in the uterus. So the uterus is actually formed in a different way. And also in a case, it's called uterus didelphys, but it's another word for a double uterus. So women who for whatever reason, when they were developing in utero, developed two uteri side by side. I will use the word uteri whenever I have the opportunity because I think it's a great word, even though I don't know that it's a real one. But it is possible for women to have like two uterus, two cervixes, and in very rare cases, two vaginas. So in a case like that, then that would be possible because if you have two uteri, then it's possible for you to have two different cycles happening slightly different times. So that's a really rare, first of all, condition that would at some point be identified. I mean, if you were having bleeding that was going on and you weren't really sure why and all those types of things, at some point you go to your doctor, have an ultrasound, and these issues would be identified. So, it would take something like that where you have a very, very rare developmental issue with the uterus and a very incredible circumstance. I mean, if this is something that occurred, it's like go buy a lottery ticket because it's such a rare situation. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, there are situations where it is possible due to the way that the uterus has developed in utero, if you happen to fall into the category of double uterus or bicornuate uterus. But at the same time, these are medical situations that would be identified via ultrasound, and you would be working with your practitioner to ensure that your pregnancies are safe and healthy and that everything's okay. So I just wanted to share this with you. And that brings us to basically the end of the episode. I don't know that I need to do a summary, but essentially what we talked about today was the two major myths. The myth that ovulation can happen multiple times per cycle, and also the myth that you can be pregnant and then get pregnant again. And so what I aimed to do with this episode was just to share the research and the science and the biology with you so that you can appreciate why these types of situations don't happen. And again, I would encourage you, if you've never charted your cycles before, and if it's something that you're thinking about doing or wanting to do, the best way to dispel these myths for your own self is to chart and to start to see the signs for yourself. The more cycles that you track, the more times that you see what happens in your body when you ovulate, and the changes that occur if you become pregnant at some point in your charting. You see how your cycles change and how your body changes when you become pregnant. You will understand for yourself how these reproductive functions work, because they will no longer be a mystery. And you'll start to recognize, like, oh, this is actually biology. This is how my body works. And this is why ovulation happens on only one day of the cycle. This is why the fertile window is quite shorter than we think. As I mentioned, from a scientific perspective, only 5 days long, plus the day of ovulation. This is why when you're pregnant, ovulation doesn't happen again. And, you can't get pregnant again while you're pregnant. So I hope that this episode has shed some light for you. I'm really excited. And I'm not really nervous with this one, but I'm excited to hear your thoughts and to kind of get into this discussion with you about the menstrual cycle and about these myths. Because honestly, until I started posting about these myths within the last couple of weeks, I didn't really realize how prevalent they still were. So for the studies that I mentioned and all the information regarding this episode, you'll find all of that over at fertilityfriday.com/269. If you are loving the fact that I went into the science and you're excited to dig into the research papers, and you just generally are excited to learn more and want to deepen into this subject, then I highly recommend grabbing a copy of my book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. As I mentioned, that book, my intention was not for you to read it and take my word for it. I did my due diligence, and it took me quite a while to write, because I wanted to make sure that I was citing what I was talking about, that I could refer you to the scientific literature, so that if you feel like looking into the evidence yourself, you can actually look into it further. I think that's really important when we're bringing the topic of fertility awareness to light, especially because of the history of it. A lot of people think that it's, hogwash and it doesn't work, and that it's the same as the rhythm method. But it's important to be able to bring the science to it so that we can just develop a better understanding and appreciation of how incredible our bodies are and how incredible our reproductive systems are, and just to appreciate that, no, this isn't just some random stuff. This is hard scientific evidence. This is biology, which then brings us to the more important question of, like, well, if there's so much research, how is it that most of us don't know about it? This is a much bigger issue than you and I, because if there is, there's a ton of evidence for everything that we talked about today and, throughout the years of doing this podcast. And so really and truly it comes back to, well, seriously, like, why isn't, to the same degree, why isn't this information taught in medical school? Why is it that health professionals aren't even privy to this information? And so it just really gets that conversation going. And I've curated additional resources for you. So the book is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook format on Amazon.com. And if you want to dive even deeper into it, you can take a look at my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. So in that program, I go much deeper into it than I can go into the book. Over 10 hours of video. I believe there are 24 videos and counting, because I can always add to it, as I go. And so for more information about my Fertility Awareness Mastery self-study program, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. And with that, I want to thank you for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate you for tuning into the show, for sharing it with your friends. If you found this episode particularly fascinating, or if you think that there's a few women in your life who would really benefit from hearing it, then I would really encourage you to share it. So again, the link is fertilityfriday.com/269. So I hope you have an amazing day, weekend, evening, afternoon, week, whenever you're listening to this show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.